Practice-based research is a term that can have a number of meanings now compared to, say, the period when I'm going to start here talking about, which is the late 1990s and early 2000s. As professional doctorates and other modes of reflection on practice that utilize or work with methodologies that utilize reflection on a subject's own expertise, their experience, their practice. Those modes are developing because, in a way, there's both an interest in the university in expanding the reach of postgraduate study, doctoral study into the professional sphere. But also, I think this idea of the practitioner as a reflexive individual has become more and more part of professional practice, perhaps since information has expanded and professional networks like LinkedIn have expanded. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about practice-based research, and I'm actually going to base it largely on my own experience. And that's not really a surprising thing to talk about, because obviously the basis of practice-based research is reflection. And so with that in mind, I'm really going to guide this as much from my own readings as having undertaken postgraduate study utilizing a practice-based research mode, as the literature, which is idiosyncratic, I'd have to say, methodologically idiosyncratic. There certainly has been a large increase in writing about design research, and indeed it's become ubiquitous in the last 10 years, I would say, particularly since the rise of an interest in design thinking across other disciplines has also increased, something which I would have to say I'm slightly cynical about, because I think that design is more than problem solving. But that's an opinion that arises, I think, partly from my own educational and teaching background. So I'm starting this lecture with the term know thyself. This is a Delphic maxim. And I think there's an idea in society more generally, it sort of intersects with sort of self-help realm, that, that there's a lot to know about oneself. That there's things that are happening that we're not always aware of, but we undertake and do through the process of just doing what we do, by doing our jobs, by undertaking our practice, whatever that practice may be. And in self-help, we've come to sort of think of this idea about know thyself as, that there is that deep reservoir, that greater reflection will give us greater understanding. And so, in a way, I think that's a useful place to start, because probably the most difficult thing about this is that there is this moment of crossing between the subjective and the objective. And there's a kind of constant battle there. And in a way, the rise of design thinking, as I mentioned, is actually something that comes from this, from a desire in some of the more scientific disciplines like engineering to recognize that there is actually that the creative processes might offer a different way into empirical research, etc. And of course, things like engineering is actually a design discipline. So in this lecture, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some ideas that come from that sort of might frame how we think about this topic, and they're old ideas. But at the same time, I think that they demonstrate some key facts about practice-based research. Then I'm going to talk about some examples. I'm going to talk about a kind of dominant model. And I suppose with that, I should acknowledge, as I'm talking about cybernetics here, which I'll talk about in a moment, and the framework of, Peter Downton's design research, the writing about cybernetics that I know about originally came from Ranulph Glanville. And also, obviously, Peter Downton's writing about design research comes from RMIT, and indeed, I'll end with my own practice-based research at RMIT. That's it. And my view on this has been entirely informed by that mode. by my education and teaching at RMIT, and obviously is completely influenced by the work of Professor Leon van Schaik, who really pioneered this methodology at RMIT to a highly successful level. We know that RMIT is running design research programs, practice-based research programs all around the world, and really most, while not everybody in the rest of the world knows they've been informed by RMIT and Leon's work, it is true and undoubtable that his contribution and RMIT's contribution, his legacy is extraordinary in this sphere. So with that in mind, I'll just start by quickly talking about cybernetics. Now, cybernetics is a strange place to start to talk about it. But again, as I say, I'm informed by Ranulph Glanville, and Ranulph Glanville was really a remarkable man, very odd man, who sadly passed away, very generous man, who was, as I understand it, one of Leon van Schaik's supervisors. And as a cybernetician, obviously, he was, involved in that generation of English academics in the 1960s. That includes Beer and others who were part of this sort of cybernetic moment, you might say, at the intersection between architecture and cybernetics. So, if we think about what is cybernetics, cybernetics in its most basic sense, is really about feedback. And so if we look at this diagram here, the sort of, this is sort of the first order of cybernetics as it's known. Pardon me. And obviously a cybernetic mode is really a mode where there's an input, there's an output, and then there's this sort of feedback process. And that's the kind of essence of a kind of learning process, right? And so, if we think about the most basic sort of cybernetic circuit, and it's one that Norbert Wiener uses in his book, Cybernetics. Here, it's a very mechanical, it's got a pre-digital mode, but, it was really based on, this sort of almost a thermostat. It's got a thermostat as the classic model, which would say that in a thermostat, the thermostat heats or cools. Then the temperature is returned back into the program to then modify the heating or cooling process. And then that temperature is fed back in again. And so that process, as it goes backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, actually is a kind of what's known as a kind of recursive process. And it's a term that Gregory Bateson utilized. And Gregory Bateson, of course, is an extraordinary polymath. As one of those people where if you're interested in Bateson, like Deleuze, the closer you get to him, the further he gets away, because he really, as an anthropologist, he worked with dolphins, he did a whole range of things. It was really based around information and communication. But for the point of thinking about practice-based research, the reason I'm talking about it is that really we're thinking about it in terms of the idea that we might undertake something, that out of the undertaking of it, and the doing of it, we might then, reflecting upon that, we might learn something, and then that we might feed that back into the cycle of reflection and action. And that's a learning process, because this is where, I often say to students, you can't fake experience. And so I'm, for instance, a very big believer in professional practice for people in the design disciplines, but without limiting what that is, because in a way, through the doing, one learns. It's like the guitar. You can learn a whole lot of theory, but until you actually do the time of practicing the guitar, you don't get any better at it. And so in a way, a reflective process recognizes that through repetition, there is a learning. The second diagram, which is really second order, which is what's known as second order cybernetics. In that process, it also recognizes a really important other factor, which is not that the input and the output just goes back into the input in the feedback cycle, but in a way that the entire terms of reference and approach will change, that there's paradigmatic changes that occur so there's not just a certainty that we kind of plug this straight back into the process and get a better version of the same result with the same framework. But in actual fact, through a kind of critical reflection, we also can really understand and learn things at a broader level about the the sort of meta ideas that we have. And there's a transformational nature which can actually bring a value, because this is one of the conundrums of practice-based research, which is what's its value beyond that of the practitioner. As you'll see, that's something I really struggled with in my own practice. So we talk about that sort of feedback cycle. You know, we can see here that this is a range of kind of authors. This is a blatantly appropriated piece of diagram, and to the person who created, I apologize. If you contact me, I will update the words. But this is really an example where there's a range of writings. You can see that in the first order there is a kind of modernist frame, a positivist frame, which is sort of like suggesting, the purpose of the model, the cybernetics of the observed system, interaction amongst variables. In a way, the larger framework of it is undiscussed to some degree. It's taken for granted. And in the second order, you can see when it says the cybernetics of observing the systems, this is where we start to see this looking back, this reflective moment. And that reflective moment, although I'm talking about it, when it says like the purpose of the modeler, this is that meta level that allows for the reflection to gain a value beyond that simple learning process that just happens quasi-automatically. This is where that larger reflection allows for, a whole lot of reasoning to come out and a whole lot of learning to come out of it at that second order level. And I think that second order level, it's interesting because in a way, the period between modernism and postmodernism is fascinating. Postmodernism, some people would say, Bruno Latour would say we were never modern in the first place. But, that there's that interesting moment there where some of the sort of certainties of modernism were disappearing, but the stylistic aspects and the formal aspects of modernism were still there. But the changes that presaged postmodernism were already happening. I would say this sort of reflectiveness is actually a kind of postmodern characteristic at that moment of intersection where there was a waning of the certainty of modernism, but it's still an interest in science and those kind of things. And so a key book, which, pardon me, I'm not sure whether it's really interesting to people anymore, but it's certainly been very important, is this book by Donald Shon called The Reflective Practitioner, How Professionals Think in Action. And, and I think it's really, I think it's a really important volume. And I think it's, it's also tied to, for example, changes like things like the Boyer model of scholarship. Like I was introduced to both of those at the same time at RMIT, in fact, by Leon, I think. They were old texts at that time, but still important because both of them, if we look at the Boyer model of scholarship, which involves, scholarship of teaching, a scholarship of research, and a scholarship of service, that's also a reflective mode because it's looking at what academics do and breaking it into these realms. Now, those have subsequently become institutionalized for promotion criteria and a whole lot of things, but that moment of looking and considering is a reflective moment, actually. And so Shon was really trying to look at this idea of the reflective practitioner. And the reason that's important is that people are busy doing, and as soon as you start to cause this or suggest that there is going to be some sort of reflection like this, what happens is that you actually open up and bring out the potentiality or the embedded knowledge and value from practitioners. And that's really important because, this idea of who gets to own knowledge is really important. And I think the democratization of the internet has really changed that. And so this allows for that reflective mode. And so, because once you start to recognize that actually practitioners know stuff, and actually that maybe by reflecting on it, they might be able to reveal stuff to others, but also for themselves to influence their practice. And in fact, Donald Shon says, that's already happening. That's just people don't know about it. Not Don, yes, so Donald Shon said that, pardon me. Thinking of Boyer. And so reflection in action. If common sense recognizes knowing in action, it also recognizes that we sometimes think about what we're doing. Phrases like thinking on your feet, keeping your wits about you, learning by doing, suggest not only that we think about what we're doing, but that what we think about doing, but we can think about doing something while doing it. And so this is where that reflective process happens. And I was always interested in, that postmodern period. I'm one of the kids where we were totally fascinated by Rem Koolhaas from OA. And I'm still interested in that thing. And often I appreciated the fact that that Koolhaas would often approach a problem by approaching the discipline of architecture critically. In a way, he would start with critique. And that's how I've always continued to work, which is, what does this thing reflect back on my discipline, which is landscape architecture? Some people might find that it's not that I'm attacking it, it's that I'm using the kind of what we would call a kind of deconstructive reading of the discipline as a way of pulling out something to then take forward. And so I think that this idea of reflection in action is something that fundamentally happens, but it's great when occasionally you meet practitioners. I'm thinking here of Robert Edmond, a fantastic landscape architect who's passed away with Hassel, and very important Australian landscape architect. He became a very generous senior practitioner who was extremely open dealing with young people. And I think it was because he was at that space where he was very experienced, but also interested at that point in renewing a curiosity in his discipline. And so I think that's an example of where some of the most senior practitioners you meet, once they've lost some of that egoistic aspect of being the expert, because they actually are the expert, then allows them to open up further. And I think that's a really exciting moment when you meet a practitioner like that. And so here's a range of diagrams and things I found around the place, I have to be honest. And, again, this is poor academic practice, but these reflection in action, thinking on your feet versus reflection on action, navel gazing. Now, I think that's a bit, obviously, if one believes in practice-based research, calling reflection on action navel gazing, it's probably a bit true, but it's actually kind of, I think, diminishes. And, this is where we're seeing here different models like thinking through experiences, discussing, journaling. This is about capturing, how you capture the reflection. And I think that is a major part, as I'll talk about in a moment. If we go to these sort of models, you can see these are sort of useful things. I've been not so interested in this lower one about feelings so much. This is this Gibbs reflective cycle. I think that feelings probably do play a part, because you do have to notice something. And so there is probably some level of being in tune to something that's going on. We're always in that thing where if you think too much about something while you're doing it, it actually stalls you. If you don't think about it at all, then this practice-based research stuff is not going to really be valuable. So there is a moment of reflection, but it has to be enabling rather than disabling. So, this is like, what happened? What were you thinking and feeling? What was good and bad about the experience? We could take the experience out and say this thing, what sense can we make of the situation? What else could we have done if you arose? What would you do again? So that's a kind of, I think, a somewhat, I don't know, it seems a somewhat negative cycle, but I think this one above is better. And so, this is Kolb's model, which is this thing, and a continuum between doing and processing, reflecting and acting, and so, where we're moving our way through that sort of cycle. And, they talk about this thing about, if you're looking about, diverging, assimilating, converging, accommodating. And so the divergence is an interesting and important part as well. And I'm probably not reading it exactly the way, but I think the idea that there is some transformative potential in your practice from reflecting on the practice is valuable. I often talk to students who are undertaking design research-based theses and say that, there's psychoanalytic versions of that, which is to say that, sometimes you'll do a design dissertation, which is about, when I was studying, I never got to do X, and now I want to do that because I never got to do it before, and I want to try it out before I graduate. And then there's another one of, over my education, I've been developing X, and now I really want to bring it home and really culminate and reflect on that. Both of those are actually reflective models, recognizing your interests and recognizing how to go forward. And so, this idea about, about having a concrete experience, reflecting on it, abstracting it, I think is actually quite important, because that abstracting process really, it is necessarily abstractive because of the fact that as you move, as you reflect, you step out of it a little bit, and you also give it voice in a way that is beyond the direct activity. The worst example I ever use is kind of one that I always think of is car parking. So, landscape architects design car parks, not as well as some people, better than others. And in a car park situation, you can get a whole lot of guidelines about how to design a car park, what a good car park spacing is, but every site is different. And so every time you try to design a car park and work out, of course, the ultimate thing is to try to how many places you can get in a car park. Those variables and those laws that you might know, parking width, bay widths, turning, etc., circulation, all those rules only gain value when you use them. And you can only, and in a way, each time you use them will help you use them better and reflect upon them. And there'll become a point where a paradigm of how you do that might change. But it's a trivial example, but I suppose what I'm saying is that the principle gains, the principle is abstract. It gains value through application, and then reflection fine tunes it for later. And this abstraction process is, in a way, allows you to bring something out of that process to give it a name and categorize it in some way, perhaps lightly, perhaps in a productive way. But it is a really important step as well for design-based research, because this question of what is the public value of my private reflection is still a major research issue where contribution and significance form the body of research. So I'll talk now about the model of design research that was being theorized when I was at RMIT. And again, this is a long time ago. We're talking about the 1990s, late 90s, early 2000s. I left RMIT in 2003. Professor Peter Downton was there, and he was a fantastic academic who was really providing a body of theorization around design research. I'm always surprised that this book hasn't been republished, his book Design Research. But if we look at his cycle, he talks. This is now we're moving towards design specifically. Now, as I've said, practice-based research is being developed in a whole range of disciplines, and I think it can be developed very broadly. And I don't think it has to be based on design necessarily. But I think this is a useful one for me and for designers as well, who are maybe perhaps the constituency that I'm interested in talking to here. And so Downton talks about sort of three ideas about design research. Probably the one that is the most common one is really, research for design. And so, models of rigor in a design practice really often come around the background research that is undertaken often onto a context, perhaps onto a brief, onto a client, onto stakeholders. And so that research is for design because it's building up a body of knowledge and also potentially a body of constraints, but a body of opportunities that can then be utilized through design in a project. And so that research is for design because its agency to design is not necessarily linear. So when one undertakes, I'm a landscape architect, and so I'm often working in that space, the space of landscape and the urban. Research into a site, for landscape classically includes research into natural systems, hydrology, soils, geology, the meteorological, site users, from William White, researching and understanding site users and how they're operating on sites. So many urban systems we can consider. History, understanding the history, for in Australia, the pre-colonial and the colonial and the contemporary history of a site, its transformation over time. Now, the agency of these directly for design may not be directly there. RMIT liked, Melbourne to some degree still likes finding ways to utilize information in novel ways to influence architectural form, in nuanced and highly specific cultural ways at different times of Melbourne's design history, undoubtedly, but still that was a sort of directness. And otherwise, there's also the fact that context can provide a sort of knowing base for undertaking of design. So research for design recognizes that we're background understanding things that enables us to make informed design decisions or to find hunches and ways forward. Research about design is really, Downton's model of research about design is more about reflections on design itself. And so in reflecting on design itself, it's really about thinking about design process. And probably research about design is what's produced the model of what's become known as design thinking is probably research about design, where we're looking at designers and design processes, we're diagramming them, etc. Now, it is theoretical, and I think there can be some value in it, but for designers, I'm actually quite cynical about this mode. For designers, I think that I've always, taken the, push people off a cliff mode of design. That's because to some degree, I think that design, and I think design research is about this, is an interior process. And like learning the guitar, yes, there is a level of theory that will help you, but as we know from punk rock, there was a lot of bands that didn't have any theory that produced a lot of great music. I never thought the Sex Pistols produced great music, but they were innovative. But say the Stranglers were amazing. Susie and the Banshees, all self-taught musicians, right? So that sort of experimentation. And so research by design about design is a reflection on design. Now, I think that there's really great value in learning about designers, and I as I mentioned, my understandings of Koolhaas's processes were very valuable personally to me. But there can be this sort of desire to sort of diagram design and diagram design processes and problem-solving processes. And I think that linearity, those models, actually can be a bit dangerous for design. I also use the example, for landscape, this idea that you have to draw from the top to the bottom. I always say, you're not in a parachute. You don't actually have to go and draw it, at the 1 to 25,000 scale and work your way down to 1 to 500 and end up somewhere at 1 to 1 over a long or an increasingly fast process of the parachute coming to the ground. You get in a design process to move around. And I think it's important when one's researching about design to be not over prescriptive about processes. Now, there's a whole body of literature that is, and there's people whose scholarship that is entirely geared towards that. And this, I mean no disrespect to them, but it's just personally as a design teacher, I'm not always sure that providing a diagram that says this is a design process really has helped any student undertake design as well as just start designing. And then let's reflect as you design about what you're doing. I'm a big believer in that mode. But still, research about design is useful because we can learn from other designers, there's no doubt. But I think trying to deduct a sort of generalized design process is probably not the most useful thing. Probably the most useful thing is rather more idiosyncratic things. And those are maybe the things that come out through reflection. So maybe research about design is actually reading somebody else's research on their own reflection or their own design practice. And the final one is research through design. Research through design is the core aspect. And again, this dumb car parking analogy is one I would often use through this, which is that we can measure a whole lot of factors. For instance, in the research for design stage, we can measure a whole lot of factors, but it's actually in the research through design stage that we really actually start to learn through practice. And so, if we go to the first and second order cybernetics model, then we would say that in actual fact, this research through design model, is about that reflecting upon itself as compared to just doing and inputting and learning in that sort of unreflective way. And so I think that research through design is something that happens automatically, but when you put that second order reflection, that's when we start to get a public benefit or some larger benefit or some transformative moment that might inflect somebody's practice. Now, this diagram I've looked at a few times. And I think, I'm not going to go into it too much depth, but, it is about this inwards and outwards process, about trying to understand how, about the relationship of the subject to the world, right? And so, it's sort of, it's almost, as I'm reading this, I can't quite immediately on my feet sort of intelligently interpret it for you. But let's look through it. Observer looking outwards, that research for design, the observer is situated outside the system, inquiring about the system. Okay, fair enough. Outwards being outside of the self, presumably, as it says, observer position of relationship to the life world. Research through design is really, about, they're saying is in a way reflecting upon yourself to discover something about the world. Research about design is a reflection. not entirely convinced by that diagram. Let's chuck it in there anyway. As we get to this one, this diagram here, again, this is what happens when you start to just sample the internet randomly on the topic. This is that sort of this thing about, I think this diagram does make some sort of a valuable idea, which is that, by saying that the research for design process is about problem definition and collecting and analyzing context, and really understanding that loop there, then in actual fact, I think that really demonstrates that idea that this is something that frames a practice that may happen. Then obviously, we have the sort of develop the design from that body of stuff where the case study analysis is quite interesting, which is to say that every site is in a way a case study of a larger way of practicing, right? You could make that argument. Then there's this reflective stage, and as we can say, that's the first that there's this sort of larger ring between this design research process, between material coming in, undertaking of design, then a reflection which might determine what we collect and analyze. That's the first order process. And then implementation is to recognize that out of that we have an inflection that occurs from our experience or from this design research process, and this informs what we would then do in practice. And I think the most interesting models of this are where the practitioner is transformed, or where not transformed in a way that there was something wrong with them before or something, but transformed in a way that through that reflection, it liberates a certain sort of practice for them. And I mean, I can't help thinking here in the Melbourne context of Howard Raggett and the work in fin de siècle, pardon my poor French there. That book there with that first generation of Leon's at that stage, in the same way that I was, before the PhD model happened in the master's model. Howard Raggett, did a whole range of studies around the knot and this sort of utilization of design generation technique, which started off manually and then ended up actually in a kind of digital realm. So, knotting as a physical thing and then utilizing a photocopy. And by the time the Shrine of Remembrance program happened, or the National Museum of Australia, that knotting had been charged by digital media and was producing physical knots, the subtractions and additions like the Shrine of Remembrance, And so for me, that's probably one of the most tangible examples of that whole process. There's an example from the Mesh book, which is a book that I edited with Jessica Blood at RMIT. And this is a guy called Roel van Gerwen, who was with the Practice Vista at the time. He came and spoke at the Mesh conference in 2002. And, this is a really interesting process for me about reflection. And so in this project, he's basically, the practice was looking at how to work with how to deal with this highly constrained street, and had a lot of expectation around what it was going to be and what was going to happen in it. It had a whole lot of factors to deal with. And, and it had a high level of community engagement with it. And so ultimately, what Roel and the team did is they said, well, listen, guys, to the community, there are this huge range of issues here that we want to deal with, and they have dimensional constraint to them. They've all got sizes, they've all got, these constraints, but we've only got a limited amount of space. And so what he did, both with the community and in the design team, was to use a kind of game-based model to sort of begin to reconfigure all of those physically to scale, to reconfigure all of those factors to sort of say, well, you want all this stuff, but how much space do we actually have? And so in a way, throwing that back to the community to say, to utilize this game, and they play with it, they reflect on it, to then generate an outcome. Now, we see game-based models all the time now of participation, and so I don't think it's super unusual, but at the time it was very innovative, and I think it demonstrates how putting people into a practice Problem-based practice, and I was sort of critical of problem-based models of design, as my old boss, Timothy Hill used to say, we're in Australia, there's no problems here. Why stop talking about problem solving? Let's do more than that. Let's have joy. But nonetheless, the problem model is still there to some degree. And I think that's a useful example of how a reflective process can lead to an outcome, because through manipulating the constraints in this highly tactile way, you actually end up with a reflective model that allows for an outcome, but also in this case, allows for a kind of consensus around the problem, because everyone's had a try at trying to solve it, and they realize, this is actually quite hard. The reflection of this is quite hard, and okay, I also played with this, and this is as much as I can do. That is a reflective practice in a way. It's probably the first order, because the second order would be then to say, what did I learn about games? What is the game as a mode? What is community? What is the communication between people? Maybe that's the second order reflection that might come out of it. And out of that, as a case study research, I think, this research about design side, case study research really is useful for this kind of finding. I think that intersection between practice-based design, case study research, really breaks down some of the polarity I was having between through design versus about design, really. And now we turn to my own design research, which has really been informing this entire presentation. And I mean, it's an older piece of research. It's from 2000, and at the moment I started in 97, and I finished in 2002. The Masters of Landscape Architecture by Research, and now it's the Masters of Research. And it's utilising this. It's in the context of the mode that Professor Leon van Schaik at RMIT developed. And sort of, that period really, it's in the 90s that began that model that RMIT's developed. And I think it's much more nuanced now. But the foundation of it, of course, is reflection, as we've been discussing. And so, it's a piece of work from the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was a junior practitioner and academic. So let's take it in that way. But it's still interesting because I think it represents a body of concerns that I still have and that have guided me actually since this point. Part of the first reflection really of this was recognition that because I was from a practice, I was from the trades, landscape gardening trades, before I studied landscape architecture, I really had that tactile relationship to the landscape materiality of plants, water, soil. And in a way, doing this made me realize that I was really interested in this, foundational aspects of the discipline. Subsequent to this, I also wrote a book called Overgrown, and my PhD investigated this notion of change. Really, all of that came from this reflection. And so I'll walk you through this process. It's only my process. It's not an exemplary process. It's just my process that I went through back then. And I think it does tell some key aspects about this mode. And so the process really starts with, with a reflection on practice. So if we look at here, you'll see that this diagram, this sort of thing, is me, first of all, sort of systematizing a range of things. And then you can see that all of them are about topography. So my first realization is that the sort of broader interest, the more broader public interest here is around topography. From that point, I was one of the, landscape, I think it's fair to say I was one of the earlier users of AutoCAD and 3D Studio Max in Australia. I think that RMIT was sort of leading that way to some degree. And, I was teaching, even as a student, teaching at New South Wales Uni and others where the people weren't really using CAD in landscape yet. And I like to say, and as I discovered through this, that the computer taught me to draw. And so, as you can see here, a lot of this is all about topography in different ways, and so you can see here like landform mesh, these different sort of exercises. And so here we're seeing, how the utilization of the sort of modeling tools for 3D landscapes then led to the creation of physical drawing techniques as well, that mimicked them, where I use the physical tool, like use the hand to mimic the tool of the computer. And so, I was really kind of analyzing a whole range of projects and competitions and teaching and a whole range of things that I was sort of reflecting on. So each of these are little bits of other projects. They're not the whole focus of any of the one. They're me pulling out a moment to try to say, how does topography inside a project inform the project? And if we take a topographic learning or approach or from that constituent project and abstract it and then put them all together, how might we understand them? And so this is the sort of first level of kind of reflection, was to sort of reflect upon all of those topographic aspects. And so, after having sort of, I sort of did this thing where I then tried to sort of organize them around certain issues. And you can see that here, we've got different colors indicate whether it's educational or what it is, or I actually can't remember what the colors really mean. I mean, again, this is like old stuff. And so you can see where, I broke it up into these, it's probably spelling mistakes in here, for which I apologize. We know that desktop publishing applications like InDesign and Illustrator, and this case CorelDRAW, didn't have inline spell checking at that time. But you can see that I broke it up into these different sort of meta areas. If you think back to the second order cybernetics, that's me trying to then sort of gather them together and organize them. And so what I sort of came up with was this series of sort of interests between methodology, representation, experience, intelligibility, and form generation. This is things about topography. And I've sort of, there are different levels of specificity. So we can say that the briefs and the situations are highly specific. So I'm working on a project in Box Hill, I'm working on something else at Bandura, I'm doing a competition, Hong Kong, etc. They're all very specific. And then I'm sort of getting those and I'm extracting out of them this interest in topography. And then I'm using that to also then reflect upon landscape architecture. So we're going from this, as it says here, from the specificity to the abstraction. And in a kind of slightly oblique move, what I then did is I then devised this process where I started to say, well, let me organize those topics. You see, methodology, representation, experience. Let's treat them as the kind of atmosphere inside which the projects were happening. And so, at that time, early Photoshop, not early Photoshop, but, again, this is the sort of graphic of the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I tried to create this interactive database idea of a PDF. I was very into PDFs because there was the promise of a non-specific piece of software that could be read. And so I created this interactive sort of system because I was really interested in the idea that I wanted to tell the story of each of these in a different way. And that in a way, design research, I was arguing, was sort of non-linear. And so I created this system of this sort of series of these kind of views. And so as you can see, each one of these is this is the online system. When it says view 1, 2, and 3, a lot of that was about this landscape. And I created this sort of series of these sort of sectional or drawn kind of frames where each of those became a landscape aggregated with all of these other bits of landscape in them. And so that became a sort of an analog version or a physical exhibited version of what the online or the sort of online CD-ROM version of this project was. I called it Topo Disney at the time. And so that was, because at that time the model for the masters, and I think it's a similar model, pardon me, still at RMIT was, what we call the three components. There was an exhibition, a presentation, and what was called the durable visual record of the document. Because it wasn't a written thesis, it's a design project that's got a reflection. And so I was treating at that stage, this idea that each of those projects, as you can see here is the discussion of, the specific nature of that project, and then in bold below was this sort of larger reflection. So what you're seeing there was a tension for me in doing this mode, which is what's the value? I mean, my parents were both historians. And so, they had a public sense of what they were doing, the significance of their research. I was really troubled at that time, I'll be frank, with that question of significance. Is it just about me? Am I just looking at myself? What's the broader thing? How do we bring out something from the personal and make it more valuable to beyond this? And so this idea of these different topics was my attempt to try to sort of make some larger conclusions. And in a way, these lower boxes were about trying to demonstrate what that larger value might be beyond the individual project. And obviously, now interestingly, and I think this is a very interesting observation, that when my examiners got it, only one of my examiners, Edward Brew, who I was partly involved in inviting these guys to get to this conference to be involved in my examination. So I had Edward Brew, fantastic Barcelona urbanist. I had Walter Hood, the extraordinary African American landscape architect. And I had Will Van Gerwen, who I talked to you about before, and they, Rule and Walter were fine, but Edward tried to print this whole document out, and he was like, this makes no sense. This is not a narrative document. And I was like, no, it's an interactive process because design research is not linear. So I was trying to find a method of representation that suited the kind of understanding I was developing. So you navigated, literally, you would click on parts of this landscape to take you to these things as a way of sort of searching your way through. But I also had a kind of a presentation with a story that gave you a summary. And so that was totally ineffective. So ultimately, I was told to make revisions, which I did. And then with the help of Sand Helsel, who was a really fantastic supervisor who helped me afterwards, I then reworked this into a sort of a linear document. And out of it, I really chose to sort of to then, in that opportunity that I had to redo more work, I thought, I'm going to really try to apply that reflective process in my learnings to a new project. And I got the opportunity to work with Kirsten Thompson Architects, who is extraordinary architect and friend. And so we worked on a project called Queensbridge Square. And I also worked with her project architect, Nick Murray, and Jason McNamee, who is a friend as well and teacher at RMIT. And really applying some of these ideas with really this interest in representation. I sort of worked on this sort of technique where we drew and explored, we sort of worked between the mapping of constraints, then the exploration between this drawn and physical mechanism, and then working our way through, modeling techniques through to vacuum form modeling, etc., and then sort of trying to give trying to really to sort of bring home some of those larger questions in the larger observations. For instance, about the relationship between the materiality of surface and how we understand topography, the way that we design, the way that we understand, use naturalistic sort of ideas about landscape to inform our ways that we read the urban, thinking about microclimate, etc. And we came up with this proposal for Queensbridge Square, of which through the vagaries of that contract and competition, and in the end, the actual developer for Queensbridge Square utilised bits of all the competition. So there's still a little bit of this red object still there at Queensbridge Square. But I suppose if we think about that process of observation, we can see that revise, reflect, implement. That implement moment was actually the moment where because I had this opportunity to make changes to try to culminate and bring it home, it really allowed me to create this final project with my collaborators that really, I think, put into practice the final pieces. Now, in a way, this process, the useful thing here was that I had to write something in the end. So you're only seeing the sort of end of that document. It's actually got the whole, another part, much larger part of the front, which is, narrative. That realization that design processes may be non-linear, reflections may be non-linear, but in the end, humans, communicate via the linear. That in actual fact, I'm talking to you in a linear process now. I'm making argument to you. Suggests an intersection with conventional modes like the written thesis. When I showed my mother and father, who were, as I say, historians, the recording, because they couldn't make it to Melbourne, they're quite old, I showed them a recording of my master's presentation. They'd be quiet afterwards, and they said to me, I said, what do you think? And they said, it's interesting, son, but it's not really categorical, is it? And what their point was is, what's its contribution? What's it actually deliberately completely saying? What's it offering? And I think this is a really important and vexed question for design research. I think it does have enormous value. It has enormous value in so many different ways because obviously, as I've said, in the designs field, we do learn from each other. Instagram is building this all the time. There is a lot of learning that happens through those things. We see a project, we hear about it. It's the result of a long reflective process. We take maybe a peripheral moment from it. It informs our own practice. Those kind of learnings, they're ad hoc, they definitely happen. Also, through reflections, we can bring out certain things. An example would be that in the digital realm, all of the work that was undertaken by earlier people like Greg Lynn and all of the range of the early digital designers, over the later generations, Michael Hensel and all of those other people in that digital sphere, DRL at the AA. In actual fact, we can see that these contributions through practices actually did shape what has become digital architecture now. But how we systematize it, how we organize it now is probably actually over systematic. I've seen some beautiful design research theses where they're much more idiosyncratic in how they're presented and much more beautiful as works. I was trying to organize this to make sense of it. And in the end, I did gain value, particularly for my teaching. Odd person here and there has seen it and found it valuable. Over time, it's informed a lot of my teaching, and so it's probably informed practices of students in a way that they might not see, but it's nonetheless been useful in some way. After this, I chose to do a written thesis at the University of Queensland, a PhD thesis. And I think it was that sense of wanting to, in the same way that my later books were about plants, after this one about soil, I think I was curious to learn more about other modes. And I don't come out at the end of it believing in less in design research, but I do think that there is a space for design research, which is actually much more about, that can be more systematic. I'm thinking of a colleague who did a PhD around certain landscape modes that were being analysed, ways of operating in landscapes. Now, there were things that were being looked at in that dissertation about landscape morphology and vegetation that were dealt with in passing, but with a tiny bit more depth, the reader might have gained a bit more insight into that moment. So I think this is about the points of externality in the project where one is aware enough that this should be told in a way that can demonstrate something broader. What I tried to do, probably unsuccessfully, was to try to ensure that the whole time I had these two narratives, the highly specific narrative and the larger reflective narrative that came afterwards, so that there was something was brought forward. Now, I now have a much more concrete idea about design research, and I can imagine it in other disciplines. And for instance, what I'm currently really interested in is, and something that, accepting PhD candidates for, would be around the reflections that happen in practice around innovation and technologies. There's a lot of people who are working on a whole range of technologies. And I would say that probably practice is leading, and particularly in landscape architecture, is leading over the universities in a whole lot of research on the edge of practice, particularly around landscape architectural technologies, green technologies. Extraordinary. Now, if you're a practitioner and you're doing a range of projects, the fact that you did it on the last project informs the next project. You did research to do that. You probably didn't have time to reflect upon it. You had to jump straight into the next one. How did people get public value out of that? So there's a mode that I'm really interested in, particularly in the space of landscape architectural technology. So call me to say, how do we really think about and how do we find a moment of pause and reflection upon amongst practice to really consolidate, publish, and disseminate in a rigorous way the findings from practice to allow for that discursive continuance. There's a kind of idea in academia that, or in research, that each piece of research is important because it's like another brick that something is built out of, knowledge is built out of. I think practice-based research, particularly if it can be, I would argue, a little bit more rigorous, particularly if we can start to think about practice-based research, not just in the design space, but also in the technology space. I think that there's a way somewhere between voluminous scientific research and entirely creative works. There's a space in the middle there, which I think is a space of enormous opportunity for actually having reflective practice, professional PhDs that really consolidate and give recognition to and reflection opportunities for practitioners. And I think that all of the disciplines in the built, particularly in the construction and the built environment disciplines, I think that professional doctorate of reflection can be valuable much more broadly. And I look forward to seeing those kind of innovations to follow.